Hello and welcome back to our next module on this unit on the philosophical branch of existentialism. As you recall in the last module, existentialism is the branch of philosophy that deals with the question of human existence. Questions of how can we be free, be self-determined, focus on our individuality so we can have a truly authentic life and engage in authentic living. The next existentialist we're going to cover is Soren Kierkegaard. We're going to cover him over the next two modules, beginning in this module with his work of Fear and Trembling. And we're going to look at how Kierkegaard approached the questions of existentialism. How do we live authentically? How do we engage in the question of human existence so that way we can live authentically? And for him, that answer is going to be found in what we call taking the leap of faith. Let's first look at the person of Soren Kierkegaard. So Soren Kierkegaard was born in Copenhagen, Denmark, and he spent most of his life in Denmark. He was born to an affluent Lutheran family, but he experienced great tragedy in his life from an early age. And this tragedy really not only affected his father, but it's going to affect him and his existential view later on. His mother died, his father's wife, as well as other individuals in his immediate family. This greatly affected his father, who soon after his wife's death had a relationship with the housemaid in their home. And this developed in Soren's father this moral angst, this unsatisfaction and guilt over the fact that he had a relationship with the housemaid right after his wife died. And so this mixed with his religious views, and he developed this very kind of, the best word is angstful worldview of the world that he imposed on Soren. So he really influenced Soren to go then study theology at the University of Copenhagen. But this view of angst, of uncertainty, of displeasure with the world, colored Soren's view of theology. And so he really didn't want to deal with it. He was more concerned with the questions of what he should do with life rather than what is truth. And so he kind of left that, went to study instead philosophy, literature, and really tried to lead a very social life, trying to seek the pleasures of the world, as it were. Right before Soren's father's death, though, he came to understand from his father where this angst came from, where this guilt came from, and the tragedies of his early life. He reconciled with his father, and now kind of separating the angst that his father had with the religious worldview, who was able to get back into theology. He became a very big proponent of Christian theology and really the first religious existentialist. And this is where his great works of Fear and Trembling and Sickness unto Death come from, is trying to understand the questions of human existence, not from a view of that human authentic living is never possible, but rather quite the opposite, that it is possible, but only through faith and only through the divine, and that we have to take a leap of faith even over the rational, even over reason, and that is the only way, in a manner of speaking, that will reach authentic living. He's also well known for writing under pseudonyms. So, for instance, the author you'll see on Fear and Trembling is actually Johannes the Silencio, or John of the Silence, which is a pseudonym that Soren used. He later died, in our terms, rather young, at the age of 42, due to illness. So his life is fraught with tragedy, but in the midst of this tragedy and this angst that really affects his existential view, that life is full of angst, that this idea of faith cuts through the angst. And so his existential view of human existence is really rooted in a belief in God. And really Soren's going to put forward that apart from a belief in God, human existence is rather unpleasant. And so God is necessary for human existence to reach authentic living. That being said, let's delve into Kierkegaard's existentialism. So Kierkegaard saw human existence in terms of three levels or stages: the aesthetical, the ethical, and the religious. By aesthetical, Kierkegaard means when we seek after goods and pleasures. Think back to that portion of his life when he abandoned theology, took on philosophy and literature. He went out in literature, went out partying and socializing and carrying on, that he's trying to find meaning in a human existence through things, goods, and pleasures. Well, Kierkegaard is saying, well, that's maybe the first level of human existence, but we need to move beyond that level if we're to live and have authentic living, to live an authentic human life. And so the next level is to move beyond things, pleasures found in goods, so to speak, and move to the second stage, the ethical, or what he also referred to as the universal. You might think of the natural law. Remember, he's influenced by Christianity. The moral and natural laws that are universal to all existence. So rather than simply seeking pleasure, he appeals to overarching meanings, principles, obligations. And so we can seek authentic living by moving beyond just focusing on pleasures from goods and experiences and moving on to living around certain meanings, principles, obligations. So we're moving from finite to infinite. Well, that is not enough. To truly live an authentic life, we even must move beyond the stage of the ethical to what he calls the religious. Not necessarily to be a part of a religion in Kierkegaard's view, but rather to be living completely in faith, moving towards what he calls the profound or the divine. It's this reliance on what transcends the universal. So we have what is imminent in front of us, what is completely finite, goods, items, things, people. We move beyond this finite and we move to more universals, principles, obligations, values. But even then, we move beyond these universals to the absolute infinite, God, faith. So it's by moving through these three stages that Kierkegaard holds that we will be able to truly live human existence, to truly live authentic living, to truly be ourselves. So his existentialism is going to be focused on moving through these three stages: the aesthetical, things, goods, the finite, pleasure; the ethical, that which is universal to human existence, principles, values, obligations; to the religious, moving to the absolute infinite, divine, the profound, faith. So let's then look at how do we move from the aesthetical to religious. This is going to be the main question of this module. How do we move from the aesthetical to the religious according to Kierkegaard? Well, ultimately, and I really want you to take this in, the main answer of how we move from the aesthetical to the religious is by suspending the ethical and taking a leap of faith. That's basically the answer. So let's look at exactly what we mean by this leap of faith, because it's going to be very important to Kierkegaard's existentialism and his philosophy. So first, it's important to note that Kierkegaard was a proponent of what we call fideism. So this is the claim that religious belief must be based on faith alone and cannot be justified by appeal to or either objective or subjective reasons. In other words, Kierkegaard was a believer that while faith and reason are both important, faith trumps reason. There comes a point where reason is limited. There are limits to a rational argument. There are limits to reason. And there comes a point where you just need to have faith in order to take a leap of faith. So if you have a rational argument, it's based on what we know. You can't have faith in it. You can't have faith in what you know. If you know it, you know it. You can't have faith in it. To have faith in something is to have faith in something you fully do not yet know. So to know something, Kierkegaard would say, is the finite. That would be the realm of the aesthetical. But to have faith in something, that's the infinite. That is the realm of the religious. And so again, we have to move beyond the finite to the religious. So we move beyond rational. And once we move beyond rational and reason, that's the domain of faith. And so Kierkegaard says we need to move towards faith, because only by moving towards faith can we move towards the infinite, the religious. He does believe in objective truth, but as I mentioned before, his view of the world is very much full of angst, tragedy, uncertainty. So that's what we might refer to as subjectivity. It is our human experiences are varied. And so while there's objective truth, it has to be applied subjectively to life. And so how do we find our way through this uncertainty and this angst and this subjectivity of life? Well, the way we do it is by putting faith above reason and simply taking this leap of faith. Kierkegaard, again, a proponent of Christianity, uses Christianity as the ultimate leap of faith. That while Christianity and its beliefs can seem absurd through the eyes of reason, it ultimately only makes sense through taking a leap of faith. In other words, realizing that there are parts of Christianity that are a mystery that we will fully not comprehend through human reason alone. And so we take a leap of faith in it, trusting in God. Because without faith, there's no relation to God. And loving God without faith is really just loving ourselves. Because we can't have faith in what we know. And so if we don't have faith, we're trusting only in what we know, which is truly just our human intellect. So to have faith means to move beyond our human intellect. And so for Kierkegaard, faith is really a love of God in the sense of giving ourselves to Him. We do not rely on ourselves, but completely on Him. This reliance outside of ourselves onto God is shown through this leap of faith. These individuals that take a leap of faith, Kierkegaard refers to as knights of faith. So the knight of faith sounds really regal, like the fairy tales of a knight in shining armor. The knight of faith is he who does not rely on himself, but solely on his faith in God. The knight of faith continuously takes the leap of faith. And by this very faith, the knight transcends the finite we are mired in and rests in the infinite. In other words, Kierkegaard is calling all of us to be knights of faith. He's calling us to be individuals who continuously take leaps of faith in trusting ourselves, even in the midst of angst and the uncertainty and subjectivity of life, in trusting ourselves to the infinite, to the profound, to God. So in this journey of human existence, while we live in the finite, the aesthetical, the rational, we have to be a knight of faith. Move beyond pleasures and goods. Move towards universals, values, principles. And to continue to, once we reach that universal, and we don't know how further we can go past our rational minds, we take a leap of faith into the infinite, into the religious, into the divine. For him, he focuses a great deal in Fear and Trembling. That's really a lot of the focus of Fear and Trembling is on Abraham. And the story of Abraham found in Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 to 19, of his sacrifice of Isaac. And he uses this to understand the leap of faith. And for him, the prototype of this knight of faith is Abraham. Abraham is the ultimate knight of faith that we're supposed to mimic. And that Abraham, by taking a leap of faith, actually reaches the infinite, reaches the third stage. So let's look at Abraham for a second then. Abraham, therefore, is seen as the model of faith. Abraham in Genesis 22 is forced into a dilemma of obeying God's natural law or listening to his personal revelation. So if you're not familiar with Genesis 22, it's a good opportunity to maybe pause the recording and go read Genesis 22, 1 to 19. Go for it. Okay, you're back? All right. If you haven't read it yet, go read it and pause the video and then come back and I'll continue now. So in Genesis 22, God calls Abraham to sacrifice his only son Isaac. So remember, he had a lot of difficulty in having a child. Now he asks him to sacrifice his only child, Isaac. And so this is a dilemma here. God's natural law dictates that killing, murder, is wrong. But God's personal revelation in that moment to Abraham is to kill his son. So here's the dilemma. Follow God's natural law of you shall not kill, or listen to God's direct command to kill Isaac in that moment. So you see the conflict between stage 2 of existence, the moral, and stage 3, the religious. There's no rational reason to justify killing Isaac other than God asked for it. It's only by faith in God's command and his word to kill Isaac that Abraham is justified in doing it. And so this is the paradox of faith, is it makes no sense for him to listen, to do what is being asked of him, but other than having trust in God. Ultimately, the story results in Isaac not being killed. It is a test of Abraham's faith. God never intended for Abraham to truly kill Isaac, but this was the leap of faith God needed Abraham to take in order for Abraham to transcend that second stage and to be able to fulfill his greater purpose of establishing that covenant with God and bringing about the great nation that God promised Abraham in Genesis. And so in this way, Abraham is seen as, again, the prototype of taking that leap of faith. Even though there was no reason for him to kill Isaac, he simply entrusts himself to God, takes the leap of faith of saying, I don't understand, but I trust you, God, so I will do this. And ultimately, he is justified in it. And as a result, Abraham is able to move from the second stage to the third stage, the religious. So this would be, Abraham, therefore, would be an example of successfully moving through the three stages of existence for Kierkegaard, of taking a leap of faith, where there's a point where reason ends. It is not rational to understand why to make this decision of killing Isaac. And once reason ends, you simply have to take a leap of faith. And Abraham does. In fear and in trembling, coming the name of the book. So as a result, where we talk about this statement not making sense, of doing something beyond reason that sounds counterintuitive, that sounds incorrect, but ultimately is what leads us to fully and authentic living, this is what Kierkegaard calls a paradox. And he says that truth is ultimately revealed as a paradox. Paradox is a successful argument that has as its conclusion a statement or proposition that seems obviously false or absurd. So while the paradox's conclusion seems wrong, the ultimate statement is true. So an example of this is saying, if I know one thing, it's that I know nothing. This is a contradiction. It's counterintuitive. If you say you know nothing, then how can you say you know one thing? But saying that you know nothing means that you know at least one thing. So in this, Kierkegaard points to his belief in objective truths. The relativist would say that there is no truth. But by saying that there is no truth is to proclaim a truth. This is what Kierkegaard means by the fact that truth is revealed in paradox. While the relativist would say there is no truth, the paradox to that statement is to say that there is no truth is to proclaim a truth. And so Kierkegaard would say the same about faith, that eternal consciousness, reaching that third stage of existence, is a paradox, because it means taking a leap of faith. It means you must first believe in the infinite, which we do not know. That's a paradox. But if you don't first believe and take that leap of faith, you'll never know the infinite. And so Kierkegaard uses Abraham to depict this point, showing that by reason, God's command was absurd. The fact of killing Isaac made no sense at all. It was a paradox. It was absurd. But it was only in following this absurdity that Abraham came to understand a higher meaning. So it cannot be made to make sense by our standards. It can only be understood by faith in God and his will. So again, the fact that God asked Abraham to disobey the moral law of killing and to sacrifice Isaac in order to reach a higher level of understanding of faith is a paradox. But this paradox reveals the ultimate truth according to Kierkegaard. And he only was able to get there, Abraham, by taking a leap of faith. So again, we move through the stages of human existence, which is a paradox, by taking a leap of faith. And by continuously taking a leap of faith, we become a knight of faith. And the ultimate example of that is Abraham. So after all this then, what does Kierkegaard mean by faith? We talk about leaps of faith, moving towards faith. So therefore, how can we understand faith? Well, as you can imagine, through all this angst and uncertainty, Kierkegaard holds that faith is a pretty difficult thing to hold. It's not simply infinitely resigning ourselves or detaching ourselves from all finite things. Rather, it's that entrustment to God. Faith is that positive giving of oneself completely over to God. There comes a point where we don't know what's going to happen. We can't rationalize in our mind the next step or why we should take it. We simply have to give ourselves over to God and take the leap and believe. And that is why a knight of faith can still enjoy the finite. You can still move through the three stages of existence and still enjoy the other two. You don't completely just resign yourselves or detach yourself from the other two, but you have to move beyond them. The only way you do that, again, entrusting yourself to God, taking that leap when it doesn't seem rational to do it. Faith is so difficult because it is the infinite leap to complete surrender to God. We have to move towards that which we don't yet know. And the paradox is the only way we'll know it is by moving towards it unknowingly. By leaping and moving towards a God we do not know. Only then will we come to know God. But if we never take that leap to the God that we do not know, who is mystery, we will always stay in the dark. So then let's return back to that original question. How do we move through the three stages of existence, from the aesthetical to the ethical to the religious? Well, this is a key chapter in Fear and Trembling, which I ask you to read, in which Kierkegaard holds that the suspension of the ethical through a leap of faith is what leads to the religious. What do we mean by that? When we suspend the ethical principles and simply take a leap of faith, even when it doesn't seem rational to do so, that is what leads to the religious. So, for instance, when one of us individually asserts ourselves against the ethical, we sin because we're placing ourselves against the universal, the ethical. So we say, I am above those moral principles, those values. Well, therefore we sin because we do not dictate the moral values. They are universal. But God dictates the moral values according to Kierkegaard. God holds the universal in place. And so God can determine and suspend the ethical. And we partake in that suspending of the ethical by taking a leap of faith. This is the example of Abraham. He was in a dilemma. Do I hold on to the ethical, you shall not kill, or do I suspend it, put it on pause to take a leap of faith and obey God's command to kill, which is against the ethical? This test of faith is ultimately what leads Abraham to know the infinite, to know God, to move to the religious. But in order to take that leap of faith, he has to suspend his ethical principles. But he only is able to do so successfully because God is who asks him to. If he does it on his own, it's a sin. But God, who controls all of the ethical, universal principles of the world, in his command, suspends it, and because Abraham listens to it as part of the command, it becomes okay. He can take that leap of faith. Again, remember, God does not have him actually kill Isaac. It is a test of faith. But to Kierkegaard, it shows that there must be a suspension of the ethical. Temptation for Abraham is the ethical itself, needing to adhere to those principles. It's moral law that would hold him back from obeying God. This is the paradox that Kierkegaard talks about. It is only because the ethical can be suspended by God's will that Abraham can obey God in faith. So Abraham can't suspend the ethical on his own. It has to be through a command of God, who sees beyond what we can see and knows what is truly ethical. Abraham does not simply obey a higher moral law, but transcends the ethical in general, because he is able to suspend it by God's command and take the leap of faith. So as a result, Abraham became higher than the universal because he took the leap of faith. So in summation, There are three stages to human existence: the aesthetical, finite, pleasure, goods; the moral, the universal, principles, values, obligations; and the infinite, the religious, the divine. And we move through each one by being a knight of faith, taking a leap of faith, and by God's command, suspending the ethical in order to not be held by our rational mind, what we can reason to be true, and simply take the leap of faith towards God. And when we entrust ourselves in true faith to God, even when it does not seem rational to do so, that is, for Kierkegaard, how we get to the final stage, the most profound stage of human living, where we live an authentic human life. So this is the conclusion of this module, and how I direct you to the module materials.